Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Chris Lubberstedt. We're at Winters Hill in Dayton. It's August 9th, 2021. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
First question, biggest question is why wine?
That's the golden question.
The $1 million question.
Yeah. I was drawn to it for, I hate to say that for the science of it, but I kind of came into it around that backside, and I really got into how the science was not only driving, but riding along with, this artistic expression, this end product that everybody was enjoying, that, it has, huge social upsides, and, it just brought people together. And, it wasn't a direct path. I wasn't like shot arrow, must be winemaker, let's do it, It just, I remember specific times along my career where I was just like, in the middle of harvest or something, and you're like, wow, this is what I chose to do. So, yeah.
Let's talk about life before wine a little bit then. Tell me about where you're born, where you grew up, and sort of life early age.
Well, that has a lot to do with the complex reason of why wine. For me, I was actually raised in the Napa Valley, and my family, my mom and dad they ran inns and bread and breakfast, so we weren't a winery family. But it was, and this is in, we moved there in 81. So early Napa, early, wine blowing up as more mainstream for America. It was something, seeing that side of it early on. I remember, restaurants not being able to stay open all winter because there wasn't enough tourism, and then just watching it continue to expand and to, I don't know when it hit that thing where it became, second most popular after Disneyland or something in California. It was a weird place to be, weird place to grow up, Being a busboy in a Michelin star restaurant, it's like, okay. So for me, Oregon, when we moved to Oregon, it was, it definitely resonated with me more that it was still families, it was still pioneering, it was still exploratory, and yet it was clear that the quality and the focus and just the intensity was there.
So what point did Oregon become part of the story for you?
95, early 96, yeah.
What brought you up?
So my wife now, we were dating back then. She had some family that lived in Southern Oregon, and I had visited Oregon, and we were looking for, kind of that place to settle down, or a place to, be grown-ups. And we joke, we almost literally flipped a coin between Seattle and Portland. So, but we knew, I think we had our hearts a little bit more set on Portland earlier on. And we chose it and kept on going, and it was, now we've got, two boys we're raising here, they're born here, and so it's become our place.
So tell me about sort of for you, like life after high school. What were you doing after you graduated high school? What was the next step for you at that point?
Oh, after high school, it was, a little bit of travel, a little bit of, who do I want to be? Who am I? The usual sort of growing up. But then I started college with a biology sort of focus. Went into biology major, and so that's where that kind of the sciencey side of the winemaking got me. It was like my ultimate degree was in zoology, and so I sort of looked at the ferments like, like big critters. They needed to be fed, they needed to be taken care of. If there wasn't something there, they acted up and got sick. Had to take care of them. And that's a lot of sort of the way I started thinking about them and getting into it.
So you grew up in wine country and watched it become kind of explode into even more wine country. So at what point did wine start to be an interest to you, either drinking it or making it?
I mean, as enjoying the wine itself, probably with working in restaurants. I was exposed to some pretty amazing wines and that side of it, and what the people talking about it I hate to say intelligently, but on a bigger level than just consuming, and putting the context of, we do all this and we put all this quality into it so that it becomes this product, and it's enjoyed in this way, and elevates food and elevates conversation, and so pretty early on. That was, can I say before 21?
I think the statute of limitations is passed on that, so you're probably safe to say that. So tell me about learning wine from that way. Were there certain wines, certain regions, certain things about wines that appealed to you over others?
At that phase, or at that time, no, I wasn't. It was definitely driven. The conversation was definitely from Napa Valley wines, and I remember hearing things like, oh, Pinot Noir. So Chard and Cab were definitely dominating, what we were all talking about, and that was a really dark time when White Zin just went. So, but when I came up to Oregon and started exploring Pinot Noir, both drinking it and enjoying it, and then beginning to work with it, I got it sort of right away. It's a special grape, it's a special wine. The complexities, the nuance, it definitely clicked.
So you mentioned that it was up here you started to kind of play with it. Tell me about winemaking. At what point did it become something you thought you could do for a career?
So literally connected with the wine industry up here through my wife's client, who was Eileen Geary, the owner of Cristom, her and her husband Paul, and talked, and they told stories about me and and what I was doing, and just finishing up my degree at that point. And I think the conversation really connected because I was studying biology, and one of my professors said, oh, there's a certain rodent, I think it was a kangaroo mouse or something like that, that was out in Willamette Valley ag lands and vineyards. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I talked to Eileen, and I said, hey, can I go out and poke around the vineyard and see if you have any of these little critters out in your vineyard? And she said, yeah. And we talked, and I wound up working a Memorial weekend in the tasting room, and pretty much never left. Started working more and in the tasting room to learn about their wines and the winemaking side, from a production perspective, and then how to explain that to a consumer, and that sort of really fueled the fires, and then started working when harvest rolled around. Worked harvest, crush crew, and with Steve and Paul and Andy, and then stayed on there after I graduated. And then shortly after, that's really when I knew I wanted to be in production. I think it was 2001, went over to WillaKenzie and got sort of a seller, full-time seller position with WillaKenzie. Jimmy Brooks had just left to go to Mesera, and Tebow was there, and Laurent was still there, of course. And so that's when I went both feet into production and just kept on moving, and left there in 2005 as assistant winemaker, and jumped over with Joe Dobbes 2005 in the new facility in Dundee, the new facility. Yeah.
Let's talk about actually, we'll start before we go to production. Let's talk about the tasting room side of things. And again, you mentioned kind of learning in order to teach. So tell me about that process for you. What did you learn about production before actually being part of it? And then what was your first production experience actually like after that?
Yeah, the whole teaching thing. You can kind of, I guess you can gauge a teacher by how into the subject they are. And I always felt like I was just honestly, kind of showing them, introducing people to what they were doing. I didn't like the tasting room experience where it was like, here's your wine, nectarine, pineapple, and cardamom, whatever. It's just like, okay, that's a grocery list. And I think unique as well that Cristom has their traditional methods, their traditional sort of roots, while I don't know if you would say minimal in winemaking, processing and all that stuff. It needs some explanation. Native yeasts and native ferments and why fining versus not filtering and all of those. It kind of, there was a story to tell there, more than a tank farm that's like, well, we open up the spigot and we hook up to the bottling truck, and there you go. So,
did you find people were pretty interested in hearing about that at that point?
Yes, yeah, and pretty soon into that process, I think everybody experiences how much to tell the consumer or the visitor. You can see when their eyes glaze over, and we're super into it, and we're going to tell you all about clonal variation and soil types, and they're just kind of thinking about lunch. So
sure. So from that perspective, then, tell me about your first production experience. What was it? What you expected? What did you like about it?
I liked the intensity of it. I mean, it was, harvest is all hands on deck and wet and dirty and you just get in there and there's such a kind of a camaraderie, because everybody that's doing harvest or on that crush crew knows what needs to be done. Like fruit's got to get harvested, the wine's got to get made. There's no stop the clock, and we'll catch up to that later. So I did like that, and then like I said, you're checking in on ferments and monitoring them, and being involved in feeding, doing ads that you need to, and adjustments or not, but evaluating through the whole step. And then that sense of accomplishment too. It's just like, 6 months later or whatever, you're like, oh, okay, tasting the wine in barrel. You're like, I remember that. I remember that when it was just a fermenter. That's a finished wine now.
Tell about the change for you then from Cristom to WillaKenzie. A big step up, as you said, kind of jumping all the way in and full time. So first impressions of WillaKenzie and sort of your first role there.
So, yeah, I mean, definitely larger production. It was, going from a winery that was like so many, kind of a converted pole barn. I mean, not really like an engineered facility. So going from that into WillaKenzie, which at the time was one of the earliest, purpose-built wineries here in Oregon. 95, I think, is when they completed the building. And, so it was multi-level, it was gravity flow, it was a built winery. Mm-hmm. So that was, but yet the heart was still there. I remember, I would still cover the tasting room during the week. We'd be racking barrels and, the doorbell would go off and, all right, somebody's got to run upstairs. And so, when you think about WillaKenzie now, being bought by Jackson Family, and you wouldn't imagine that it was Bernie and Ronnie LaCroute, their vision, and they were there all the time, and it just to see that progression as it comes up. There's still a lot of wine brands where the winemaker, you'll bump into them, either in their tasting room or they'll be pouring wine for you. Mm-hmm. But I think it's stark to when you look back and say, oh, that's where that did start up, and then it gets bought up by a bigger company and becomes this bigger entity. But yeah, that was and that was it didn't feel impersonal. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to a tank farm. Even though the facility was there was still Laurent Tebow and myself, running around the cellar. So still very personal.
Tell me about working with those two.
Very cool. It was at one point, I think, in the production staff, I was like the only like native English speaker. So I felt like it was like reverse. Between Daniel Fay was the vineyard manager at the time. He was Swiss German. We always had interns from either from France or from New Zealand, and so it was definitely multicultural, great experience. And Laurent being part of that early clave of, I think they called themselves Party of 8 or Party of 5, and they would run around to restaurants and go to markets. Laurent and Lynn Penerash and Steve Dorner was part of that, and Ken Wright. Sorry if I'm leaving anybody out, no disrespect. But yeah, that led to kind of telling the Oregon story. And that's always something that I have not forgotten or taken for granted, that I was, I got to be with those people and learn from them, who ultimately kind of went on to build the Oregon wine community to what it is today. I don't know if I'm overselling that, but it's kind of the way it is.
So what was your role when you were hired at WillaKenzie, and how did it evolve over the years you were there?
Cellar guy, yeah, and like I said, kind of run in onto the tasting room every once in a while, and then production. This was early 2000s, so we saw that. Was it the .com kind of boom where people were really collecting wine and buying wine, and our production increased, and our our demand in the cellar went up, and so it just kept on scooching more into more and more production and more responsibility as I stepped into it too. I was still pretty green, and it's a couple years in is when Laurent left, and then he started Northwest Wine Company, So Tebow got the tap to be winemaker, and then I stepped in with Tebow to be his assistant. We had some PhD students as like long-term, also, you know, kind of assistant winemaker, lab, doing a lot of research. Bernie was really into to research and experimentation for not like, you know, let's hybridize this, but more like how do you best extract, you know, how do you manage tannins, you know, very pointed research topics.
So the next step for you was then you said to Dobbes, the new Dobbes. So tell me about that transition for you.
So that's really when that was another, you know, escalation. Because I remember telling Tebow that I was leaving, and he was just like, well, why? You know, everything's like working really well right now. And WillaKenzie was 100% estate at the time. Even Red Hills, their Red Hills property was coming online, but that was still estate, you know, state fruit. And it, you know, we really were just getting everything sort of dialed in. And I kind of realized, unfortunately, that's not how I'm going to learn. That's not how I'm going to progress with experiences and you know, development. So I wanted to throw myself into something, you know, another challenge. And Joe was, you know, he was building three-legged entity where it was Wine by Joe, which was unique at the time too, because those were, you know, that was when Pinots were $60, $75. Everybody was looking at single vineyard, you know, and he and a few others went the other way and said, hey, let's see if we can do like a sub $20 Pinot and bring it, you know, grocery store, go that direction. So that was Wine by Joe. And so he had these, you know, big fruit contracts that he had arranged and had this, you know, bigger volume production while he was still nurturing up Dobbes Family, I think is what he called it, which was his high-end single vineyard, you know, traditional model. And then he threw in custom crush in this facility, so making wine for other brands, other wineries that didn't have a facility. And he located a building in Dundee that was like a warehouse and retrofitted it. And that was right in 2005. And so he hired me just before that summer. We were kind of getting the building ready. They were still cutting drains in the floor, and you know, we were fitting tanks in, and a couple of them were a little tall, so there were some logistical challenges. But that was, you know, that's where you learn. You know, you're in the middle of harvest, and we figured out the tank was too tall to dump over the top with the forklift. We couldn't get the bin over it. It's like, oh man. And there's a truck outside with fruit. So, and you know, and he was pulling in fruit from all over the state. A lot of Southern Oregon contacts. Several of the clients were Southern Oregon fruits. And so that exposed me to, you know, other fruits, other varietals, you know, the things that you just, you know, solve on the go. And you know, he definitely had the direction and input, but it was all, you know, there was a lot of innovation going on. Yeah.
I'm curious about that. Tell me about some of that. Is there anything that stands out in your mind as kind of problems to be solved, kind of in the heat of the moment?
Well, when a grape truck flips itself over trying to back up in the parking lot at 11 o'clock at night, there's some challenges. Yeah. I think what came out of that for me was chaos is kind of going to be there for harvest, and you can't predict even your pick times. Your best practices, your vineyard manager, they say they started picking at 10 and fruit's going to be on the truck, and you'll see it by 2 o'clock, and when 6 o'clock rolls around, it's not there. You just can't lose it or take it personal. I've always sort of made it a conscious effort to just keep calm and be mellow about harvest. It's crazy enough. Yelling and throwing buckets is not going to help out anything. So that's certainly that, that level of new dynamic. Yeah, that definitely shaped me going forward into the next, what I wanted to be as a winemaker and how I was going to address it. I was like, oh, okay, I get it,
Well, I'm curious to ask about that next, but I'm also curious, like you talked about kind of the new model at the time of the high-end brand, the kind of grocery store brand, and also the custom crush. So you're doing a lot. You got a lot. You mentioned chaos. That sounds very chaotic. So tell me about managing that. How do you manage that many different things going on and make sure everything gets the time and attention it needs from you?
Prioritizing, knowing where things are going at the end. I mean, making sure you have the sort of the roadmap or the vision of where things are headed, and then you can pick your battles. That the machine harvested fruit is coming in, is going to get this kind of treatment because it's going into that bottle, that SKU, versus the hand-pick lot that's is going to be single vineyard and came from that source. And so that was also the thing about harvest was you really just have to be so incredibly mindful of every detail and know where those bins went to, that had from a specific vineyard. I mean, it seems somewhat obvious, but just can't let off on the details at all. But you can pick your battles, and so you gain a little bit of breathing room by knowing, hey, this wine's going to get this, and it really, it's going to get this treatment. So that makes a difference. And it's always the high-end single vineyard blocks that have the accidents. Those are the tanks that the forklifts just automatically roll into. Magnet, I don't know. The bulk tanks, nothing can happen to them. No.
With the idea of Wine by Joe, which of course at the time was somewhat novel, as you mentioned, I'm curious about that challenge. You mentioned the challenge of trying to make a good Oregon Pinot Noir at that kind of price point. What did you learn from that for yourself going forward? Did you feel like the goal was met? Were you making the wines you wanted to make at the prices you wanted to make at that point?
Honestly, I wasn't in enough of a management level to really. I was more the observer and the instrument to that production. So I don't feel like I really couldn't answer that. I really didn't have a say. I think we were still, even in Oregon high production, what we were, big volumes. It's still just a drop in what some global producers are doing in, kind of we call them these tank farms, these larger volume facilities. So we're still just small scale, and even though it's big for Oregon, big for Willamette Valley, it was still hands-on winemaking. So you kind of have to put that in perspective too. It's like, 10,000 or even 5,000 cases was like a big deal versus somebody's 50,000 case lot that gets made. Yeah, definitely even that has a bigger impact, or a bigger, overall impact. And so, yeah, I think the wines were still very much genuine and handmade, and just trying to get those price points down. It's just tough with Pinot. The farming costs up here are higher, everything. We didn't have the economy of scale, and so it was, that was, at some point it just became a battle for the sales, marketing, and accountants, to duke it out on how low you could get the price.
So at this point, you've been at 3 different places, very kind of different styles, different sizes, different shapes. What's sort of developing in your mind at this point as to what you want to do? If all the barriers are gone, what do you want to do? What do you want to see in the future for yourself? And what's the next step for you towards that goal?
So the Dobbes model was definitely, experience builder, kind of hardened my resolve, sort of like, all right, if you can handle this, you got it. And so I got in contact with, or was connected with, Alan Methvin, and he was building. He had a piece of property down in the old Amity Hills that had some vineyard land planted on it already. I think it was 28 acres at the time, ballpark. And then he wanted to build a winery on that property. So we got connected and hit it off, and I got the tag to kind of drive that, and we built the building in summer of '07 and had grapes in it, that vintage. And it was, and so what drove me to that was back to the estate fruit. Here was estate fruit, managed for single vineyard, quality, quality focused, straight to the tasting room. Back to that. I knew I didn't want to go on in higher volume production. That, while I appreciate the experience, and what it did for me, it wasn't what I wanted to do. So, yeah, going back to the single vineyard and estate driven fruit was the path for me. And the family aspect is cool, where owner operator.
So that's a pretty big challenge then, trying to, you have the space already, but now you're trying to build a winery. So tell me about that. I'm curious about what you had seen, what you advised on what the winery should be and should be able to handle, and then sort of what your role was in finalizing it.
Yeah. So we talked about, it had to sort of make sense economically. It wasn't going to be, a chateau style, anything over the top. It was going to be a production facility. And one of the things, after going through the Dobbes facility and sort of taking that from a warehouse to a winery, and then coming from Willakenzie, that was engineered, and visiting other places and doing harvest and in other facilities. I wanted something purpose-built, but open floor plan, and kind of a nice big concrete box with good floor drains and plenty of water pressure. And so that's what we did, and it made sense. We were able to get a little bit of a gravity drop and some hillside, kind of coverage for the barrel room, so it was partially underground, and had some cool features like that. But ultimately, it was really pretty open floor plan, and that's what we were all after. It made sense. I mean, it was, it's a little bit cheaper to build and super flexible, and so.
So once it was built, what was your kind of role at Methvin at that point?
So I was winemaker. Alan and Jill, they weren't in production, so they leaned on me heavily to drive the winemaking and build the style, the brand, and we would check in and talk about what we're doing and what direction we're going and what direction the fruit was going too, because it was fairly young vineyard in full production by the time the building was up, but the identity of the vineyard was yet to be determined. And we had Pinot Gris, several clones of Pinot Noir, some Riesling, Chardonnay, and this was also 2007, 2008, Oregon Chardonnay was less than spectacular in the sales world. So we grafted over 2 acres of Chardonnay to Gamay Noir. And I'd worked with, WillaKenzie had Gamay. Bernie and Ronnie had planted it because they loved Gamay and enjoyed the style that came of that wine. And so I enjoyed working with it. And I was like, hey, Gamay is awesome. So we planted that. And I feel like that was now Gamay, I mean, time will tell, but there's a lot of Gamay that's getting planted right now. So it was interesting at the time.
So that's a kind of a big challenge for you then, sort of developing what's coming from the vineyard, developing a house style from other people's palates. So tell me about. I'm curious about that. How do you go about something like that? How do you sort of present the options and make a plan?
Yeah. So my touchstone to that was I did a vintage in Australia with Gary Farr at Bannockburn, and he had made a lot of wine. He was personal friends with Jacques Sayce over at Dujac and had done several vintages, and they were friends. And so Gary had kind of a deep perspective of the wine industry on multi continents. So I appreciated his wisdom, and he said, always make wine that you want to drink because you may have to. So, and I like that, and that's where I started, because that's you have to be connected to what you're doing, or else it's it's not going to work out. Your heart's not in it. But there is that consumer side where the consumer palate will sway and look at Oregon Chardonnay. It's like it wasn't working out for a while. Now it's back, and there's styles have shifted a little bit, but the consumer palate will. You can make a wine that you want to drink, but if you can't sell it, then you're not going to have a successful business. So I think that's the big ticket, is to modulate those two. Be true to yourself, either connect to customers that have palates like you or enjoy, or or temper the difference between what you like and what you want to present. But I think fortunately, the wine lovers and wine consumers, they do get that somebody made this wine and they had a personality, and especially here with so many small producers, so much of that is personal style of the producer. Kind of the age when the winemaker rock star was a little bit more driving it. People were buying names. So and that helped kind of educate people as well. Like, hey, it doesn't have to be formulaic. So
How would you describe your style at the time? Obviously, you had quite a bit of experience, but it's kind of your first time putting your own mark on a brand. So,
Yeah.
what was the style of those wines?
I wanted something that was not going to overpower the site. Again, I'm still trying to figure out what that vineyard was really capable of. So I went in there a little, a little, I don't know if generic is the right term, but, not putting too much style onto it. And heard what the Cellar Club, what some of the buyers were looking at. And then worked from there. But once I found out that the site was a little warm and it tended to be fairly ripe, I believed in embracing, and I still believe in embracing kind of from the fruit forward, adjusting alcohols or picking early, to keep alcs down. Or I think vineyard decisions are probably better than winemaking decisions. Adjustments in the fermenter, in the winery. But I did want to be true to the fruit and not go back and be correcting. Because those were, we had vintages like 08, fairly warm, and then you went into 10, which was cool and small harvest, and then 11, which was, very wet. And so I just felt like if I was always, if I'm always trying to have some magic number in mind, I'm just going to be chasing it every year. Oregon has vintage variation. That's the other thing. I mean, it's like I want to express what happened that year. And I let that dominate the story. That and playing with clones or bottling single clones, bottling single blocks, really driving the sense of place and the differences. Even in the 20 plus acre vineyard, 30 acre vineyard, you've got these subtleties in the blocks, which were awesome.
What about learning the vineyard? You mentioned that was part of the big challenge for you. Was what does the vineyard have? What can it be? How long does that kind of thing take? How long did it take you to feel comfortable and confident making some of those vineyard decisions, as you mentioned?
I think the growing wine or growing grapes in Oregon with the vintage variation and the weather patterns that we have. Just when you think you got it all figured out, something just comes out of nowhere. So I tried not to be, still now, I try not to be overly complacent or like, yeah, I can, I know what's going to happen. If you don't, and relying on the quality of the fruit basically from bud break is kind of what you have to rely on. But it's Mother Nature. Things happen. You can have some great plans. They don't always work out that way.
And then you're managing chaos again.
Yeah.
So tell me about the next step for you at that point. How long were you at Methvin, and what was next after that?
So I was there until spring of 2015. And in that time, we at Methvin, we also the economy changed. We were came out of the .com and that bubble, and then went into recession, and it was tougher to sell wine, and people weren't buying, and so we pivoted a little bit into that custom crush model. We took on clients. We tried a second label of Pinot, and so we did. We had some steps through that, which changed the direction, kind of, of what, well, both Alan and I thought we were doing in 06, 07 versus, all right, it's 2013. What are we doing now? Adapt and grow through it. So I looked at throughout winemaking and through what resonated with me, like what I kept on getting excited about in the winery, started to be some of the technology in winemaking, some of the, always been kind of a gear, not trinkets, the stuff, shiny, stainless, so I got into the supply side in 2015. We have a unique store here in McMinnville, Davison Winery Supply, and unique because it was brick and mortar. It was like a grocery store for winemakers, and there's not a lot of those places around. You'd walk in there, and there'd be one guy getting a package of yeast and a glass carboy because he was making something in his garage, and they'd be right next to the winemaker for the second largest producer in the state. It was an interesting environment, and so I started talking with Steve Davison about, well, I'm a winemaker, and if I was there on site, I could just give a little bit more of a been there, done that advice to the supplies, and then also work with the suppliers to let them kind of see what's new in the industry, what's coming down the road, and try and make sure that we had that and stayed connected to the new stuff. So that was a great experience.
It's a big change.
Yeah, I dug that, and we were raising my kids, and wife and I were building our family, and it was kind of nice to not have harvest, be gone for 3 months, at least mentally, at home. So that was a different, a bit of a change. It was just something, we wanted to try.
What were the best parts of the experience for you? What did you enjoy most about it?
I like the access to the education. It's kind of like to be paid to read the wine catalogs and to know what's going on, talking to people all over the world about the support side of winemaking, what they were doing, what they were seeing with their winemakers in their regions, and a little bit bigger perspective. I guess if I was kind of up on the hill at WillaKenzie, and then went to Dobbes to gain a little bit bigger perspective of what was going on there. I was on the hill at Methvin, and then left there and kind of saw a bigger perspective again on an even larger scale about what was going on in the industry.
It's really interesting. Kind of interesting when you map it out like that. It's a very interesting way to look at it. Were there things that surprised you that were going on in the industry that you hadn't sort of realized, kind of being down in the trenches?
Yeah, I mean, there's you see the business side, and hearing stories about even what you would think would be the most with it and together brands or winemakers still have challenges. They're like, oh, but they're golden. They're doing great. They have problems too. Yeah. So I think that was it.
Were there any interesting, kind of interesting shifts in the industry that you were aware of in that point? Or any technological or kind of new things were coming online?
Well, the biggest, one of the interesting shifts at the time was kind of not what was coming on, but what was happening at the same time, and I think that's the rise of the natural wine movement. So people were, and I mean, I don't know the exact timeline. I don't want to, say, oh, well, natural wine started, in 2014 on December 3rd. But it was about that time, when we would you'd reach out to somebody, or you'd hear more of this, and more of the natural wines were coming online, and so then you'd reach out to a winemaker, or you'd have a conversation about, hey, this new product. And they're like, oh no, we've gone vegan. We're not adding anything, in that world, and both. Yeah, I mean, both from this is what we're doing, to a, you're just peddling snake oil, like you just want us to add more stuff to our wine. So really visceral reactions sometimes. Mm-hmm. And often from people who didn't know exactly what they were doing, so.
So I obviously, like I said, it's kind of a big change for you coming back into that side of things. Did you find that you overall enjoyed that being a salesperson, being a supply person, and what brought you back into production at that point?
So, yeah, I mean, I did enjoy it. It was cool. I couldn't stay out of production entirely. So in 2015, I told, for harvest of 2015, I told my wife, hey, we could, I could make a little wine on the side. I know plenty of people. We could, get ourselves a little license and rent some space and, make a few hundred gallons. Of course you can't stand to see grapes go to waste. So, it's September and like, hey, Chris, you want a couple tons of Pinot? Of course, bring them in, come on. So we kept on tripping down the path of a small brand for ourselves. And honestly we weren't really thinking about we're going to be commercial. We want to this is our plan of build a winery, get a vineyard, take this into this production. We kept tripping through it, and one of the big trips, or no, one of the big signals was my wife she always wanted some bubbles. So I said, you know what, I've got the time. I'll make a small batch of bubbles, some sparkling wine. So we agreed to do that, and we called it Stedt Wines. And so in 2015 we made some Pinot, made a little bit of bubbles. I did a sparkling rosé Gamay. So back to the Gamay. Big fan.
So even after all this time, this is your first bottle with your name on it, or at least part of your name on it, at least.
Yeah.
What's that like for you? What was the process like? Was it different than you expected?
It was. Several of my friends teased me because back, in say 2 or 3 years prior to that, they'd say, well, when are you going to do your own brand? I'm like, no way, are you kidding? I know. Not going to do that. So there we go. Let's start a brand. Time management became a little crazy. I thought being gone at harvest, working as the lead winemaker took me away. But now having a brand where, I've got a full-time job that's, in the wine industry, so there's a lot of cross, everything dovetailed, it all worked together. But it was still just, I think I worked more at that time, just in both worlds, because, all right, I've got, finish up work in the shop and then go do punch downs, or, go bottle at 7 o'clock at night, and then try and sell it on the weekends. And so it was, that's what kept, that was definitely, the big, oh yeah, now have your own business, you're working all the time. There's just, you're never off. So that was a big thing. And then, but we kept on building that, and our philosophy was single vineyard and single variety. So I wanted to keep it very, very focused, very specific. Not I don't think we ever had big aspirations of production. So I just wanted to connect small vineyard sites, specific locations with what they had planted there, and bottle those. Yeah.
There's certain types of place or certain varietals, other than obviously bubbles, that you were excited to work with. What were you seeking?
Into aromatic white. So Gewürztraminer out of the Columbia Gorge. Love that area up there, the Underwood, Washington side. 1,300 foot elevation, volcanic silt, just screams, just awesome whites, great acid, and lively aromatics. Fantastic site. And it's like, just with my experience or exposure, you just see little gem pockets that are all over the valley of, there's this, found own-rooted Pinot Gris up in Forest Grove, and just tucked in the firs up there, something with some identity, some real personality. So things like that. Found some Gamay down down by Wheatland, the old Danauer farms. Yeah, they had Gamay planted back in there.
Awesome. What about, you mentioned trying to sell it, obviously a whole other challenge. So tell me about that. How do you, once you've decided you're going to make a commercial brand for yourself and you got a name, what are the next steps towards kind of making it a successful brand?
Well, that was certainly a big learning point, and I think ultimately like a bigger philosophical question that I was, that I wrestled with, and we just, still talk about it, still trying to figure it out. I think a lot of people are, and that was, I guess I'd summarize it like, how do you connect with those customers? And when I kind of put it into my historical perspective, I've seen the progression from, I remember back at Cristom, and one of my roles was to manage like distributor allocations. And so back then, and Cristom was it's a legacy brand. It's fantastic. And they're trying, they've got all these distributors clamoring to get the wine, and managing, you can only have 5 cases of the single vineyard. You can you take some Pinot Gris to get your 5 cases? There was management of distributors, and then the pendulum swung over, and now at a point, definitely even coming out of that now, or a few years back, where wineries can't find a distributor to represent them. Like, please, somebody pick me up in a state, just, and so that was a huge shift. That distribution model, the way wineries interacted with it, as and that's all. It's and I think it's also it's not really tied to. I don't want to say quality of wine, but taste of wine. It's not saying I can't find a distributor because my wine sucks. It's purely business decisions. I think the consumer, I think now the quality of wine has never been better. The entry into commercial winemaking is not my wine's better than, I mean, the bar is set. It has to be on point. Mm-hmm. There's no room for bad wine out there. It's not going to last, you know. So it took away the being able to just say, you know, my Pinot is super handmade and it's awesome. You know, I do this. I was just like, well, everybody's doing that. I mean, it wasn't the story, you know. Like, I think at OPC or you know, the Oregon Wine Seminar, there was was it Cole Danauer, who was talking about if one more person tells me I'm passionate about Pinot, you know, it's just like that was overused and underwhelming. So that conversation all changed. It wasn't about that. And so then it became, you know, connecting to the sales world or selling your wine. It became personality was involved. It was like, you know, you had to go out and work the market and connect with the buyers and people, and you know, if they liked you and they liked the wine, they brought it in. You know, if they didn't like you and they liked the wine, you maybe got in. If they didn't like the wine, they didn't like you. It was, you know, forget it. But it was there was a lot of development, and that, you know, that was something I had to learn. I didn't, you know, I kept on thinking with past experiences. I'm like, oh, it's just not like that anymore. This is changing. This is changing. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely the challenge for so many new producers, or even existing producers, because the market keeps changing.
Mm-hmm. How did you find success? What were the sort of successful strategies for selling wine?
Having the wines have their own personality. Developing that line between having a wine that was like so funky it was odd, but not be just varietally correct and just, you know, such a narrow focus. It didn't really speak to anybody. I think what the response that we hear about the wines, or the Stedt wines, are that, you know, the wines are really interesting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We did. People like the labels too. We did a unique piece of artwork for each SKU, and the artwork kind of told a little bit about the style of the wine, and you know, it was the packaging, you know, the whole. My wife and I, you know, being the seller, genuine, mm-hmm. you know, a lot of that plays into it too. Like the buyer has to know that you're not, you know, just schmoozing them, selling them something. They feel connected to you and what you're doing and what you're selling and everything. Mm-hmm. You know, there was intention in all of that. I use an intentional winemaking in a lot of our discussions, because that's what it is. Mm-hmm. You know, you can have happy accidents, but you know, we're very intentional about what happens. Mm-hmm. So,
had you found that by the time you were making your own wine, that your philosophy or your style of winemaking had changed, and if so, how would you sort of describe the philosophy behind the wines under the Stedt label?
The winemaking, I don't know that it varied too much from even, back in the Methvin days, because it was this very similar. Like, I always think, if you're kind of in this small batch world, and you've got, each fermenter has the opportunity to be its own wine, really. And so there's not a ton of difference if I've got 5 fermenters or if I've got 50. That's still pretty small scale. And so I just, from the Stedt, okay, I've got 2 fermenters, It also makes it very critical that every gallon counts. I'm not blending away anything. I don't have the luxury of, I'm just not going to use those barrels, So a little bit more pressure on just everything has to be spot on. And then I also use that to give the wine personality. I'm not blending away for, the reserve or the, tastes the same as it did last year. It's like, yeah, there was variation. Used a different barrel and, went through ML slower, whatever happened, builds that personality in there.
So at what point does Winter's Hill become part of the next step for you?
Yeah, so earlier this spring, I was connected with Russell, a Gladheart up here, and he was looking for an associate winemaker to come in and help with production and be a new voice in production, because the facility here is it's a reoccurring theme. It's much like Dobbes and Methvin. Russell's got the Winter's Hill brand, and then has custom crush clients that are here, and those clients, they have different requirements of help and where they, what kind of assistance during harvest, and then also during the winemaking process, how that comes in, and then helping Russell with development and growth and evolution of the Winter's Hill brand. So I was pretty excited about it. This is a great, it's a phenomenal site. The vineyard that they have here is amazing, kind of hallowed ground. And I'm excited to work with New Fruit and work with Russell and the family and see what we can do going forward.
So you mentioned still pretty new at the role here, but
yeah.
what have you seen so far, and what are you kind of thinking as you look ahead to the first harvest here for yourself?
Well, back to estate driven, so it's nice to going through this summer, being able to drive down and check out the vineyard and see in real time, all the time, where we're at and what the evolution is, how things are progressing towards vintage. And with the clones, with the blocks that they have here, again, getting back into site expression, block expression, differences in those things, in those sites, even though they're feet away from each other, continuing to express those. And I haven't done a ton with Dundee Hills fruit in my career, so that's a big step as well. Kind of been an Eola Hills Pinot guy, so.
Branching out,
right?
Branching out into the red clay.
Exactly, it's everywhere.
So let's talk about the industry a bit in general. Obviously, you've been in it quite a while. You've seen quite a bit of change.
Yeah.
From kind of your first impressions of the Oregon wine industry to now, what are the biggest changes for you? What have you noticed by the industry that's changed the most, and what does the industry kind of look like now in 2021?
Yeah, it's early on. It was interesting, kind of coming from Napa, and a lot of those early tasting room visitors up here would ask, well, is this going to be the next Napa? You know, is this, you know, what do you guys, Napification, what you're charging for a tasting fee? You know, what is this? So you hear the, you know, I always wondered what would be the growth? What's the, you know, what's the potential here? And ultimately geographically, it's so much more spread out, and the vineyards are not contiguous. It's not block after block. There's certain areas where they are, but you know, you're always going to have fantastic vineyard, hazelnuts, fantastic vineyard, you know, there's a grass farm, there's a blueberry stand, you know. So it breaks up that, you know, mega overriding force of vineyard, and that doesn't have to take away from the focus of the wines that are made, or say that it's not a vineyard region because it's not planted 100% to vine. So I think that's, you know, to our advantage, that there is some diversity in what Willamette Valley and what all the, you know, the sub-AVAs have going on. I think it's still site exploration. I mean, I mentioned the Columbia Gorge, and there's still sites that are getting planted up there. Just a phenomenal place. And sites here. You know, I think yes, we're getting some outside resource, some investment, some money from bigger companies and corporations that are going to come up here. It's going to happen, but I don't think that's not a negative in my opinion. It's more validation that we're on to, you know, this area is worth something. So it's a good thing. And I think people are, you know, wine is firmly into our culture. You know, it's not a novelty. I think maybe one of the best things that have come out of the last, you know, people being at home a lot in the last year or so, is that they've reintroduced wine into, they have a glass of wine, or, you know, share a bottle of wine at dinner on a Wednesday, and everything works out okay, you know. So, you know, just putting it back into our you know, our routines and our fold, like it introduced to some people that weren't used to that reserved it for a special occasion. You know, it's like, no, have some wine with dinner. So that, I think, has been positive growth.
How about the wines themselves? How have they changed in the time you've been here? It's
that consumer palate, I think. Like I mentioned, quality has probably never been better. I think the baseline of what the consumer is going to run into if they just go and grab something off the shelf is pretty high, higher than it probably ever has been. I think the wines, we are probably more responsive to the customer or the consumer palate now. Maybe before it took a lot longer to get feedback, but now it's almost vintage to vintage. You know, hey, people don't want high alcohol wines. Okay, let's not pixelate. You know, decisions are made a little bit quicker. And Yeah, I mean, as those bigger companies and bigger investments come in here, I mean, you see a little bit more of the volume-driven stuff, and those are still, I think those are on the peripheral. I mean, this area is still going to be about high quality, really like personality-driven wines.
So what about as you look ahead for the future? What's coming next for the Oregon wine industry? And is there something you're looking forward to or excited about? And is there conversely something you're fearful of or worried about?
I think one of the big things is probably going to be varietal exploration. It's not necessarily going to be all about Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. We're seeing other things planted, Gamay and Cab Franc and other varietal, distinctions, more than just a novelty. Like, hey, let's plant this and see what happens, but really, really focused. And that's great. We don't have an AOC that tells us that we can only plant this, and so we can do some exploration. Yeah, I mean, I can't even begin to really grasp what the weather is going to do and what we can plant, and what those impacts are going to be. But that ultimately does also support varietal exploration. So that's a little bit of a chicken and egg. I don't know which came first, because people started talking about planting other things, a few years back. But that's definitely coming down the road. Absolutely. And quality is still remaining high. I mean, there's no. You asked if there was any big technology things. I don't see anything major in wine making, machines, products. Though there's always innovation, stuff that makes it, a little bit better. But I don't think winemaking is too art driven, art influence, personal style. And also the randomness of farming, it's a natural product. To have one thing come in and just revolutionize the wine industry. I would hope not.
What about for the future for yourself? Obviously, new position here.
Yeah.
You got your first harvest coming up here. Tell me about anything else you're looking ahead to in the future, or anything you're excited about?
I'm excited about it all. I mean, especially you come out of the last year or so, and it sort of renews your enthusiasm to just still be kicking around, still be doing what you like to do. I mean, that's awesome. That's what I would look forward to. Keep plugging away, be part of the experience.
All right. All the questions that I have for you, Chris. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here that we should have covered?
Wow. No. That's
in depth.
That's pretty in depth.
That's always the goal. So I'm glad it worked out. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing with us your stories and your thoughts, and go and let you off the hook.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.